21 News, your place for politics. This is Decision 2024.
With Decision 2024 in the rear view, we're now looking forward to the Trump transition back into office in the new year. The voters have spoken, and we reached near historic levels for turnout. So we are going to take a look at the policy changes, cabinet picks, and everything that could take shape in the new year. I'm joined now with the 21 News political panel. We are back to go over all the topics. Youngstown State University history professor Dr. David Simonelli is joining us today. We have Kent State University political science professor Dr. Danny Chand and 21 News political analyst Justin Mitchell. So let's start with some of the biggest topics that we've heard about from the campaign trail spilling over now into the headlines for heading into the inauguration and the new year. Trump is working on his cabinet. He's positioning himself with some familiar faces and names within his orbit. Developing this afternoon, Matt Gaetz says he's, though, withdrawing himself as a nominee for Secretary of Defense. We also have Trump's selection for Secretary of Defense, Pete Hegseth. So he's a former Fox News anchor, veteran. What are your key takeaways on the people that he's picked so far and their backgrounds, how they would maybe carry out the role?
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead.
I think he is trying to pick people very much against the bureaucracy in Washington, and it seems much more inward-looking than outward-looking. More interested in reworking who the civil servants are and whether they're loyal to him or not. As opposed to, what it seems, any number of these positions actually does. For example, Hegseth has been talking about how women shouldn't be in combat roles, and there's been word that he is looking to purge a lot of generals that would have challenged Trump's authority back when he was first in power. I mean, that's not so much looking at whether you're supplying Israel, for example, with missiles, or whether you are supporting Ukraine in the war against Russia. That seems to be more, Washington seems to be more the focus than the rest of the country.
And historically, has that happened with any other presidency where someone takes over and picks maybe allies over, folks that are maybe already in those roles or coming up the ranks?
Well, I think a lot of the time people tend to pick allies for these kinds of positions. But the fact that you don't have a whole lot of them coming out of Congress or with a lot of necessarily experience in either overseeing those departments or participating in them. I think that's kind of unusual. I mean, at this rate, is he going to choose, Cookie Monster for the Secretary of the Agriculture? It's to that level where he's choosing people that are, seem to be, particularly with like a Matt Gaetz, people that seem to be directly opposed to what, necessarily the goal of the department is as far as enforcement of United States law and administration goes. So, yeah, it's hard to say where it's all going to end up. And if there's one thing that I've figured out about Trump in the past 8 years, you really don't know where anything is going to result based on necessarily historical precedent.
Dr. Chand, what are your observations as we move into the final weeks of this year, into the new year? We're going to have a whole new administration, and they're working through their picks, though Gaetz is most recently dropping his name out of the picks.
Mm-hmm. No, I don't disagree with much of what's already been said. This is highly unusual. As was noted, it's pretty common to pick people that are aligned with your political views, but for Trump, what he's most seeming to be concerned about was just loyalty. Are they going to be loyal to him? Matt Gaetz is an extremely out of the ordinary pick to pick someone that was up until very recently, being investigated by the very agency that he was now going to be tasked with leading. Hedsec is also extremely out of the ordinary to be head of DoD. I'm actually a public administration scholar, so what we study and what we focus in public administration is government administration. We study how the government runs and how public servants go about doing their jobs. And most Americans don't really realize just how big the Department of Defense is. The Department of Defense is enormous. It's actually bigger than most governments in the world. You're talking about millions of employees when you also take into account active service. Major budget, and he's appointed someone who is a weekend television personality to be the head of that agency.
He's also a former veteran, though.
He is a former veteran, but you know what? Just because you used to be a bus driver doesn't mean you're the head. You're qualified to be the head of the Department of Transportation. I'm not taking anything away from his veteran service. That's excellent, and I commend him for it.
Right.
But he has no governmental management experience. He doesn't even really have any private sector managerial experience.
I mean, I have a question. I want to jump in because I would agree there are obviously things that are out of the ordinary about some of these picks, but I don't know how out of the ordinary in some cases. And the example you just gave made me think, because you used the transportation secretary as an example. And of course, the current transportation secretary was a former mayor of South Bend and didn't have any transportation experience either. So I guess my point being that to have somebody in charge of these agencies who's a political ally without the experience, that's not necessarily out of the ordinary. And yet I think we can all agree that some of these picks are much further there. So I guess, can you quantify how far out of the ordinary it is from politics as usual?
To me, this is pretty far out of the ordinary. I mean, you're talking about Pete Buttigieg being appointed Department of Transportation. I mean, he has mayoral experience. He has run for public office. You know, mayors do deal with transportation issues and stuff like that. It's a little bit of a jump, but it's not that tremendous. It's not as different as picking someone who only has television personality experience. The same thing with Gates. I mean, Gates was a former member of Congress, but the real unusual, and I guess he's going to go back to his position now, but the real unusual aspect of that is the fact that the guy was under investigation by the very agency that he was going to be tasked with heading. And that really gets into the I think, bigger, more pressing concern for, I think, a lot of people. Feel free to disagree, but the concern for a lot of people with the incoming administration is just how much he's going to weaponize public institutions to serve his own benefit. And at the top of all of those agencies is, for Trump, is going to be weaponizing the DOJ to go after political opponents.
If that happens, we'll have to watch to see how this transpires, especially who gets picked, because if Gates has already dropped out, who's to say some of these folks survive the next several hours versus weeks, days. Moving forward, though, because you had mentioned about military and migration, Trump has proposed using the military to round up migrants, but it's not a cheap endeavor. There are estimates out there that this is going to cost billions of dollars to physically carry that out. How do you do that? Does he have to have congressional support, and will he likely get it because of the makeup of the House and the Senate?
Well, I think, one thing that I have not seen brought up too often is that this has actually been done in the past. In the 1950s, there was what was referred to as Operation Wetback. During the Second World War, we recruited Mexican workers to come up into Texas, Arizona, and New Mexico in order to bring in agricultural crops. And when the war came to an end, a number of these workers continued, making regular seasonal migrations into areas and, presumably moved out into other jobs. And there was a concerted effort made on the part of the Eisenhower administration to, find them, wrap them up, and bring them back to Mexico. I'm not totally certain it was an Army operation, but it was a big
But it was very deep.
Yeah, it was a pretty big operation that the government went through in order to do it. Certainly, you know, I mean, whether you think that's the right thing to do or not, it's a different question, but it's not totally unprecedented.
Okay, so how would that work? Let's say something like that is about to take place. Would there be steps? Would it be immediate? Would they have enough workers to pull this off? They're talking about securing the border and then also removing people. That takes a lot of
two different
manpower.
things.
Yeah, two different worlds.
Yeah.
So first of all, that is an excellent description of the old Versero project and Operation Wet Rack under the Eisenhower administration. That is the last sort of major effort to do a mass deportation. Big difference. Now we have more undocumented immigrants in the United States than back then, though. The estimates right now, and for your viewers who don't know, the issue area that I study is immigration and U.S. immigration enforcement. The estimates right now are that the U.S. has somewhere between 11 to 12 million undocumented immigrants in the United States. Answer your question, can he do it? Does he need congressional approval? No, he can go after them as directly as he wants without going through Congress. If you're an undocumented immigrant in the United States, technically you could be deported at any time. Now, under the Obama administration and then also back under the current Biden administration, the administration's put in guidance for agencies like Immigration and Customs Enforcement, ICE, and basically told those agents, look, when you're enforcing the law, we want you to focus on, you know, capturing and deporting immigrants that have criminal records and have committed serious criminal offenses. Being an undocumented immigrant is not a criminal violation; it's a civil administrative violation. So you could be in the U.S. and still not have committed any crime, right? So the Obama and Biden administrations tried to focus ICE on going after people who had criminal records, who had considered what they've considered aggravated felonies. When Trump came into office his first time, his first Homeland Security Secretary, who is General Kelly, who later on became his chief of staff, he rescinded Obama-era guidance and just said, ICE, you can go after whomever you want. Anyone who's undocumented, you can round them up and deport them. So we know that he's already unleashed ICE to do that before. What we did actually see an increase in deportations and administrative arrest of undocumented immigrants in the United States after he came in from that first transition. But we didn't see mass 12 million deported, and that gets to your second question. Can he theoretically do it, and then can he practically do it? The practical point I'm a little bit more skeptical of, because it takes a lot of effort and a lot of money and a lot of time to be able to try and find all these individuals. And unless they've already been arrested for a crime and then their fingerprints and biometric information has been submitted to the federal government, it's really hard for federal authorities to be able to find a lot of these people. They will find some. They will find a significant number, but being able to deport all 12 million, I think it's going to be tough. The other big reason I think it's going to be tough to do this is business and industry has a lot of incentive in keeping these people here, especially agricultural industry. And they may push back, and I suspect they will.
And what's the percentage then of those, how many people do you need here to fulfill some of the jobs, like those jobs and other jobs as you go up, down to the South, you notice it a little more in hospitality also, and agriculture, as you mentioned.
Well, one thing I just want to throw out there, though, about this is that, this is very much focused on Mexican and, Latin American immigration being undocumented. Correct me if I'm wrong, but the largest number of undocumented immigrants in this country is actually Canadians whose visas have lapsed. Is that correct?
I don't know about Canadians, but yeah, it's about 50-50 now between lapsed visas versus people who
people who are sneaking over the border trying to find jobs, and there isn't any kind of effort being made about these people that are just as legitimately here and just as legitimately undocumented. So there is kind of this sort of racist element to it. in pushing that kind of issue.
To answer your question about percentages, I don't know off the top of my head, but an extremely high percentage of agricultural labor is based on not just immigrant, but also undocumented immigrants, also in construction.
Okay.
So even places that are not necessarily in the Southwest and have a large Hispanic population would still be hit pretty hard if construction.
Okay. In the media covering this, because we're slowly unraveling from the election the results. We're getting piecemeal, whether it's, okay, here's what the polls got wrong, or here's the stats on who showed up and who turned out. When you look at a transition in the coverage we're seeing in the news, and we're obviously going to have to follow the selection of not just the cabinet, but also maybe some of the first steps. What is sticking out to you, and do you think that the campaign is going to be as organized, or the cabinet, the administration will be as organized as maybe their campaign was?
Well, to answer the second question first, the answer is no. I think that, when a campaign, you can focus for a few months and get a message that works and ride it out. But when the palace intrigue starts, I mean, we've seen this before. This was what the first Trump administration was like. You can like some of the successes, not like them, whatever. But there was definitely a lot of backbiting. The long knives were out a lot for a lot of the people in the White House. And quite frankly, he seems to thrive on that. It's not... I wouldn't be the first person to say that he likes that celebrity apprentice kind of mode of who's garnering favor. So that will lead to some chaos in governance. As for the media, we have to be very, very diligent in a way that we probably always should be, but more so now because there are certain guardrails that don't exist, and we need to be able to point out when the lines have been crossed. And so we need to know what those lines are. For instance, like we're talking about using the military to deport migrants. Now, as we've all just said, yes, he's got the authority to do that. But where there's a difference is that the Supreme Court has given all presidents immunity over official acts. And as the commander-in-chief, it's not just official acts of deporting migrants. This is somebody who's reportedly talked about wanting the military to use them against, say, protesters. Well, that would be, at least in modern history, not unprecedented, but a shock to the conscience. That would be past a guardrail. We need to be watching for where we're drifting if we start drifting into territory that's dangerous so that we don't hit a point of no return. So we need to be very clear-eyed about the fact that there's policy, there's bluster, and there's this is not okay. And keep an eye on that ball so that we don't get to this is not okay, because we need to get to a point where reasonable minds disagree on things without it being a civil war.
And it seems as if there's probably some powwows post-election on what went wrong, what went right for each campaign. And they're all doing their research at this point to see what has happened and what will happen next. We'll have to watch. We're also watching for the executive orders, though. So within the realm of what you're paying attention to, because this will be historic, some of the things, but boiling it down to the basics, I had a question, David, about the fact that there have been a lot of executive orders and then a president takes place and then flips them or removes them right away. We've seen that a lot. It just seems very turbulent in recent election cycles. Has it always been that way historically, though, or is this the norm?
There have always been a lot of executive orders issued, but they particularly ramped up with the George W. Bush administration. When you were running two wars, you were fighting a war on terrorism. There were any number of them that were thrown out in that period, and the Obama administration followed up on that.
Oh, yeah.
DACA was originally an executive order. I forgot what DACA stands for, but the
Deferred
Act
Action
for
of Childhood Arrivals.
Children of immigrants brought into the country. That was a prime example of one of the ones that they issued. And a lot of the time what ends up happening with executive orders is effectively you're kind of waiting around for Congress to get around to legislate them into flat law. To continue that precedent of the actual number of executive orders, I don't think would be unusual now in the 21st century. What those executive orders are about and how they are expected to be followed up on, that's very hard to say.
When you're peeling away at different regulations when you take office, one of those executive orders might be, related to that, or just regulations in general. Can that happen all at one time? Let's say you have campaign promise, for example, Trump on drilling and fracking. Our neighbors in Pennsylvania, that's a big issue for them. Can that happen day one?
Well, that seems as if it is what they're aiming at.
Okay.
They basically have, with what largely amounts to a mandate from the American people. I mean, I've heard a lot of people questioning, Trump has not gotten 50% of the vote. Well, he certainly got a Republican Senate, Sherrod Brown being voted out. And, there were, 3 other senators that lost their seats. He has a mandate in the sense that, the American people chose specifically not just to put him into office, but to put him into office with what they expect to be pliant congressional bodies in order to bring it out. And so you can expect over the next 2 years, you've got 2 years till the next election, executive order after executive order after executive order, in order to accomplish that. And then, it sounds as if the effort is being made to then turn to Congress and expect them to back that up.
Are there any regulations or anything you're watching? Go ahead.
Yeah,
Simon.
I would add. So, I love talking about executive orders. Such a nerd.
Yeah.
I
think
so
we're all into
get so your viewers get a little idea of what an executive order is. Sometimes when people in the press talk about them, they're
Sign
a little
the
bit,
paper.
a little bit off. An executive order does have the force of law, but basically what it is the president is ordering a government agency, or in some cases he can sign an order that orders multiple government agencies to go about enforcing the law in a specific type of way. So that's how he's able to get around. All laws have a certain amount of vagary to them. The Clean Air Act has it says, hey, EPA, you go out and you regulate particles, pollutions that are hazardous to health in the air, and you'll define what is hazardous to health. The president can sign an executive order and say, okay, well, I want to exclude these chemicals, or I want to. Right? That's kind of how an executive order would work. You mentioned DACA. That was an executive order signed by President Obama. Trump tried to repeal it in his first term. I don't know if y'all remember. He tried to repeal it. That would have gone into effect had it not been appealed all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court said, okay, President Trump, you do have the power to repeal DACA, repeal this executive order, but you went about it the wrong way. There's federal law called the Administrative Procedure Act, and it says that you have to get sort of public comment period whenever you're going to change the law, even through something like an executive order or agency guidance. He didn't do that. Now, issuing all these executive orders, to get back to your other question, is that unusual? No. We've had a lot of people in recent years issue a lot of executive orders, especially as government, the role and scope of government agencies has grown. Right. What would be really unusual, though, is if Donald Trump were to say to the Supreme Court, you know what? You said this was unconstitutional? I don't care. I'm still going to enforce it. Mm-hmm. That would be highly unusual. And he came extremely close to doing that in his first term. The Census Bureau, when they were getting ready to send out the census in 2020, had a question on there about, are you a U.S. citizen? That was appealed to be removed. The Supreme Court said that needed to be removed because it was put on there improperly. And Donald Trump darn near said, I don't care, Census Bureau, send that out. Now, he was stopped. He was stopped by members of his administration. But just like you said earlier, Joe, there's a lot fewer guardrails right now.
And you bring that up because that was one of the things that, and I can't remember if it was before or after he was named as VP. I believe it was before, but J.D. Vance had famously quoted Andrew Jackson as saying, Mr. Chief Justice, you've issued your order, now you enforce it. The point being that he was saying that Donald Trump ought to ignore the Supreme Court. And this time around, these people that he's surrounding himself with, like you mentioned, that they're there to largely, they seem to be at odds with the the missions of the agencies that they're in charge of, that's not uncommon either. I mean, certainly there's a conservative view that these agencies should be smaller, and you put people in that want to shrink them. What I think is interesting this time around, though, is that the first time around, Donald Trump wrapped himself around with a lot of people who knew the workings of government because he knew he was coming in as an outsider. This time around, and he's malleable. I mean, the people who flatter him are the people he likes. He said that. That's nothing, unusual to say. The people who have flattered him this time around and do have some common cause are very, very far to the right on those issues. So they're talking about completely eliminating agencies as opposed to shrinking them. And they do believe more so than the first time around in confronting those guardrails like the Supreme Court in ways that that lifetime Washington insiders do not. And I'm curious from a historical perspective, if that happens, can you walk that back? We talked about executive orders. They ramped up in George W. Bush. They're commonplace now, right? I mean, these things, once they're in place, they don't go back.
Yeah. There's really kind of, I've talked to my classes about this. In this country, and I think actually probably in most countries in the world, there's really two constitutions. We have a, capital C Constitution, which is all the laws that are written out that determine how government is supposed to work. But there's a small c Constitution, which essentially amounts to the way that Americans think things ought to work. And what they do is they tend to use what is written into the documents as tools in order to bring about the standards by which they expect to live their lives. And I think that's what we're really seeing here, and what is potentially, and I don't say this without advisement, revolutionary about Trump being in office. That it is distinctly possible, particularly considering that that Supreme Court ruling, that he can act in pretty much any way that he likes as president, so long as it is in his capacity in the job. By the way, by a bunch of people that are supposed to be originalists, that are supposed to be interpreting the Constitution the way that the writers of the Constitution intended for it to be enforced. He is going to have an opportunity here for at least the next 2 years to push that small c Constitution according to how people want to see the large C Constitution enforced. And it's very difficult in terms of precedent to figure out what those results are going to be.
I would say, to answer your question, Jeff, can we walk these things back once the precedent's been set? It's really, really, really difficult to do so.
Definitely.
If you ever get a chance to read the Constitution, I highly recommend it. It's really not that long.
No.
Article 2 of the Constitution covers the powers of the presidency. You can read it in 5 minutes. Very short. The vast majority of tasks that the president goes about committing each day, those are based on large part on norms. Some of them are based on statutory law, but you know what? If the president decides to break statutory law, what are you going to do about it? Short of impeachment, that's it, right?
Especially now.
Give you an example of what you were talking about. FBI director. That was a position that was established after J. Edgar Hoover finally passed away, and after the Watergate scandal, Congress said, you know what? We want to have FBI directors that serve 10-year terms. We're going to try and make them non-political. So the term of the FBI director will overlap any individual president, right? And every president up to Donald Trump respected that. We only had one incident of an FBI director ever being fired. That was under Clinton, and that was because he was under investigation for improper use of public funds, right? So every president up till Trump said, you know what, this was the FBI director chosen by the previous president. It may not be my choice, but I'm going to stick with that. And then what happened when Trump came into office? He kept James Comey initially because James Comey accidentally helped him his election by releasing letters about by Hillary Clinton.
The
He kept her initially, but then he pressured him to try and get him to drop the Russia investigation and investigation into his first national security advisor, Michael Flynn. And then he eventually fired him. And what was the repercussion of that? Nothing.
Yeah.
When he comes in this time, we can make a bet. Is he going to fire Christopher Wray? He will. He will.
Now, let me
That
ask
was
you-
not supposed to be the intention, though.
But now, and obviously, an FBI director is different than a special prosecutor. But interestingly enough, he didn't fire Bob Mueller. Richard Nixon did fire Archibald Cox.
He tried
So-
to, though.
Yeah,
he
right,
tried to. And the reason why we have special investigations now is because of the Saturday Night Massacre by Richard Nixon. He pressured his White House counsel, Don McGahn, to try and fire Bob Mueller. And McGahn refused to do so. He said he would resign. Why do we know that? Because McGahn himself had to testify under oath to Bob Mueller, and Bob Mueller asked him, did the president try and get me fired? And McGahn said, yes, he did. He also asked McGahn, did he tell you to not tell me this under oath? And Don McGahn said, yes, he asked me to lie.
Yeah.
But was there any repercussions for that? Going forward, our future president's going to think twice about firing the FBI director if the FBI is looking at members of their administration, the president themselves, members of their campaign.
Well, it's a good conversation. Thank you so much for joining us here, guys. We're kind of out of time. We could keep going. We have the wars overseas I wanted to dive into, but I think that's a long conversation, maybe one on its own. I very much appreciate your expertise. Thank you so much for taking the time to join us right here in our Decision 2024, now moving on to 2025 set. Thank you so much for being here, all of you.
Enjoyed it.
Yeah.
Hope we didn't ramble too much
No.
for you.
Yeah, right.
Thank you. Good history lesson, too. Thank you. All right, and if you want to watch the rest of our panels, this one too, all you have to do is go to the YouTube page for WFMJ. Make sure you click subscribe so that you're getting all of our videos. And also you can watch us on the 21 News app and WFMJ.com. Thank you for joining us.